Mandy Colleran, and welcome to the second episode of Making Art Accessible from Unlimited. This week, we're talking about the limits of access, the practicalities, tensions and conflicts of being fully accessible. Is it ever possible? First up, we hear from Bannon.
I'm Bannon, and I'm an artist working mainly in performance and choreography. And a lot of my work is based around the senses and the ways that our senses interact with the way we see the world, feel the world, and how they shape our identity. So I made a work as part of the Unlimited programme in 2015 called Exposure. And Exposure is a one-to-one performance, so it's me and an individual audience member, and we repeat the work for each individual audience member. And Exposure is looking at some of the ways that my identity interacts with being highly visible, so being a person with albinism who is very visible in public space, and also questions about invisibility and the way that my low vision makes parts of the world kind of invisible to me. One of the inspirations for the work was about the eye examination and the moment in an eye exam where they turn off the lights and you're alone with this stranger. And so the experience for an audience is that you are in a very, very, very dark room to the point where you can't really sense your hand in front of your face, and that you are guided through a kind of narration of my voice that you listen to on headphones, and there are moments of exposure, by which I mean there are moments when I am lit, or I show you a photograph in torchlight, or there's things that kind of flash upon your vision. The work's dealing a lot with vision and about difference and disability, but it was quite a difficult point in the work when we were thinking about how to make that work accessible for audiences who couldn't use the headphones. So that's actually a range of people, but primarily we were thinking about people who are deaf or hard of hearing, and how could we make that work accessible. So some of the things, so the work had audio description for visually impaired audience members. There were lots of access provisions we did do in terms of the spaces we chose and how we hosted people in and out of the work. And we were able to find some solutions for some people with hard of hearing experience, such as people using particular types of hearing aids. We found this system that replaced headphones with a neck loop. What became a kind of ongoing conflict was around how deaf audience members could experience the work, because most of it's in pitch black, which means that any form of BSL or captioning couldn't really work. And then also BSL, because it's one-to-one, it felt very important that the work was just me and the audience member. It was difficult. We tried lots of different things and got feedback on things like giving the transcript of the text either before or after the show. We tried giving documentation, which we were able to put captions on to audience members. And I think those things were helpful, but they were not the work. And I think for me it came down to this question about what is the kind of alchemy or the particularities of this work, and if you take away one of them, which is this real-time narration, is that work good enough or does it convey enough? And eventually we made the decision that it wasn't, and so for the live work we couldn't offer the work to people who couldn't either use the neck loop or the headphones. And that was a pretty sticky realization to come to. For someone, access is really important to me. I need access to be in the world, but also I want my work to be fully accessible. I guess what I was concerned with was not fudging it and making a kind of clear decision and being able to stand behind that decision that this particular work wasn't accessible because we tried a number of things and they weren't communicating enough about the work. I mean, I think it can be an incredibly useful dilemma to find yourself in, because it pushes your kind of creative muscle and rigour to try and find ways to try and think about what is the central idea that's being shared here, and therefore maybe there are different forms of how it might be shared. I think also you have to work backwards and think about the people that you're making that work for, or that who aren't easily served by that work, and bring them into that process. I definitely had an experience of anxiety that that to not give access to, in every way, to every audience member was this was this awful decision, or this wrong decision, or and I think that I interrogated that and it passed, but I think that on the one hand I think it was necessary, that you should care if you're excluding people from your work or from your building or from wherever. And then I think that the other thing, and I think it was talking with the Unlimited team and Joe and other members of the team to hold it more lightly. I think that what can sometimes stop people trying to make their work or their services or whatever accessible is this fear that they're going to do it wrong. And that on occasion that can be used to challenge yourself and make yourself push yourself, but actually quite often it makes people shut down and become defensive and not try. And so, I just wanted to talk about recognising that feeling in myself of feeling like, that I'm a bad person, I'm a bad maker, I haven't found the solution. And just to kind of maybe allow that as part of the process. And to not let those kind of fears of getting access wrong stop you from attempting to do it.
Thanks, Joe. That was really, really interesting. So good to hear somebody really thinking about the way that access impacts their own practice and their own personal experience as a disabled person. Next, I spoke to Nickie Miles-Wildin, co-artistic director and CEO of DaDaFest, which is a disabled people's arts organisation based and run from Liverpool. Hi, Nickie.
Hello, Mandy. How are you?
I'm all right, love. Yourself?
Yeah, not bad, thank you.
And nice to be speaking to someone who's working from the motherland.
Well, you say working from the motherland. I'm actually working from Manchester.
Oh, of course, yeah.
But, let's let that go, shall we?
Yeah. Okay, so, Nickie, DaDaFest has got a long legacy of working with disabled artists and also providing access for audiences. Coming in fairly recently, how are you approaching and maintaining building on this legacy?
Well, Grace and I joined the organisation in March 21. Legacy is the right word, because there's a really high standard to which we're coming in. That's already been at Dada. So for us to kind of feel like the weight on our shoulders, the kind of legacy of this organisation is massive. I'm sat here talking to one of the people that was kind of one of the first founders of it back in the day, Arts Integrated Merseyside. So it is that thing of knowing that, I'm always think I'm sitting on the shoulders of giants anyway. So then it's thinking around that development of that work. We're building on what has already been at Dada and kind of talking to artists around and audiences around what would make the work even more accessible. So for us, having just had our Scratch Festival in November, we had it as an in-person event. We also had it live streamed and then available on demand, which was new to us, new to Dada, new to us working there, thinking around how are we going to make that accessible, because that's the key, isn't it, is since the pandemic we're working in different ways, we're working quite hybrid to make sure that we aren't forgetting our audiences and our artists. So for us, that was key, thinking how can we integrate access in that way. I don't think we got it right. I think we did an okay job, but I think there's a lot that then we think about and take on to the next festival of how we make it better.
I wanted to ask, there's an approach that tries to give everyone, that sees access as giving everyone the same experience. And there's the approach that says actually you need to give people different experiences because they have different access needs. What do you think about that?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I always have this whenever I'm making work. I always have in my head, what's the experience for deaf audiences? What's the experience for visually impaired audiences? What's the experience for any audience? And I think we have to remember that art's really interesting because we don't expect everybody to have the same experience, because what you see in a piece of theatre will be different from what I get from a piece of theatre. What you see in a painting is different from what I get from a painting. Therefore, I always think the beauty of access is how is this story going to be told, because everybody's going to get a different experience from it. This is a really muddled way of doing this, but I think there's something around, like, I always think of making my work for visually impaired audiences. Chloe Clark said to me, who is a brilliant visually impaired actor, audio description consultant, it's that thing of thinking of it like a radio drama. So straight away I'm like, yes, this is what a visually impaired audience needs. And then I know from working with Ali Briggs or Hemi Bahane or EJ of that element of what's needed for a visual element. How do I integrate BSL? How do I have creative captioning? How does that fit the aesthetic? Therefore, just being aware that people are going to have different experiences. But I would also say, I think sometimes we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to make it fully accessible. And sometimes that's where we fail, because we haven't done that to 100%. And I don't know if we ever can, being completely honest.
No, I think that's true actually, because I think, there's a very basic thing which you can't please everyone all the time. And I think that brings me actually to my next question, which is actually, I think it's fair to acknowledge that occasionally, access needs actually bring conflict with each other. I mean, what's your approach to this?
I love it. Because I'm like, it's an absolute head, but it's around what's my creative opportunity here? Can I make it work? For instance, when I was doing Forest of Forgotten Discos that Jackie Hagan wrote up at for Contact and Hope Mill in Manchester, there was one point where we had the character of Alexa, who was the knowledge of the forest, see what we did there, where we had her audio describing what was happening on stage. And because it was for young audiences, it was in the style of it's a 30-second makeover type feel. And we had her facing the audience, talking about it, describing it, but nobody was signing it. So what was really interesting was some BSL users came to see the show and were they got really irate at that point. They were like, what's going on? Nobody's signing, what's happening? And then I was really angry at myself, because I was like, of course they can see lips moving but they don't know what's coming out. And I'm like, but this is for the visually impaired audience, because the deaf audience are getting it from seeing it visually. So I was like, okay, how do I solve this? I just turned the actor upstage, so the audience couldn't see her face, they could still hear her describing it, and then for the deaf audiences she was just able to point because they were seeing what was happening. So it's around going, how can I fix this? I would say what I would really love to be able to make it work better is a 6-week rehearsal process, making theatre, so you can fully take it on. But I think it's also around having those lived consultants in the room. And I would say it is incredibly difficult. But for me, that is the creative challenge. We have our own impairments, which doesn't automatically mean we have the knowledge of everybody else's lived experience either. And as I say, we aren't given a magic handbook of everything around being disabled. Do you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't mean that we become these big, like, experts in everything. I'm learning. I know what my lived experience is, but I'm still learning. And I know I'm going to get things wrong, but it's that thing of just being interested in making the work and telling and the stories and making the art that we want to make.
So you're involved, obviously, in commissioning artists and companies. So within those, both in terms of choosing artists and also negotiating with artists their project, how does access factor in at that stage?
From those initial conversations is where I'd like them to happen. They haven't necessarily happened, and that's been part of being a new part of an organisation and still trying out. But for me now, working with the artists that presented work at Scratch, it's and I've asked them this recently, of thinking how they're going to integrate creative access into the development of their pieces. And that's what we work with them on, and then we start thinking, who do we need to kind of bring in to enable them to have those conversations. And because I do think, as disabled artists, we do have a responsibility of making our work accessible.
You know, I agree, but I can imagine there are people who would not necessarily agree with that. You know, that it's not an artist's responsibility, and I think that's a very interesting, debate for the future, really, of the sector. How much is the responsibility of the artist, and how much is the responsibility of the venue, for instance, in promoting access, or, the production company themselves, or whatever.
But I think if you're an artist making work, then I would say lean into what the creative opportunity of it is.
But again, as we came back to, and we mentioned earlier, I think, that it is valid for artists to say, well, actually, if we do it in that way, or we add this layer on, that makes what I'm trying to do, the story I'm trying to create, the message I'm trying to, the vision that I have, the piece I want to make, quite different. And it, without the artist, there is no piece of work in a way. So it's a balancing act, I think, isn't it?
I think it's a balancing act, and I think it's around really exploring what those other. And I hear what you're saying, but I think it's also around exploring what those other creative opportunities could be. If it's not going to work within the vision of the piece, what could an alternative offer be that sits alongside the original piece?
Well, thank you very much, Nikki. That's been fascinating as ever, and fabulous to talk to you. And good luck with everything. And I'm really glad that you and Grace are there at DaDaFest and taking the organisation to the next stage.
Thank you very much. That means a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. Always good to hear your thoughts. Next, we spoke to artist Rej Patel, who was commissioned by Unlimited in 2021.
Hi, I'm Vijay. I am a performance artist and theatre maker. I make solo work, which is often autobiographical, stems from my intersectional identities and how I kind of see the world and how the world sees me, I guess. Up until the pandemic, I was making work that was touring across the UK, and then when the pandemic hit, I changed my focus to working in ways which is advocating for neurodivergent disabled people and creating hopefully better conditions for them to work in. So I was recently commissioned by Unlimited as part of their R&D Awards to start a project called Brotherly Otherly Disorderly. And the premise of the piece is to work with my younger sibling who is also autistic. The project is about brotherly care, allyship, and how we navigate a world, really, as autistic individuals. So in terms of, I guess, access and maybe conflicting access, the process of making an access rider for Jaden as a young person was quite difficult, I think, for both of us. There was a lot to kind of get through and work through, especially for someone who doesn't really understand access, and that, you know, as a young person is not really like an uncommon thing for a young person to not know what access is and what it can do. But I was utilising my kind of like skill set and expertise in the arts to make that for him. So I got a much better understanding about what his access requirements are. Having used an access rider myself for a number of years, I'm quite aware of like how much they change and how much I have to regularly review it and update as my access requirements change. We then realised that obviously the access requirements that we have are so kind of individual, and they really rely on working practices and how you work together. So it definitely becomes challenging when you're trying to navigate holding another person's access requirements and your own, if you're in a creative process that is quite individual, that is quite self-led. I think we were constantly holding that for each other, which really made the show and what we were making much richer. There's constant work to be that is being done. When you're making things accessible, you're kind of constantly reevaluating how things are going, checking in, making sure that it's constantly happening and it doesn't just get forgotten about. So with that being at the forefront, there's a lot of brain energy going on when you're thinking about, okay, are my needs being met? Is Jaden's needs being met? And he's probably doing the same thinking as well, but from a younger person's point of view. Yeah, so in terms of what people would expect, what access people would expect from a Vijay Patel show, I'd say historically, my previous shows, Sometimes I Leave, was kind of looking at how I can create some access provisions for me as a solo performer on stage. So the one thing and in the name of the show is that I might leave at some point, and having the door open creates a purposeful, relaxed performance, and that there's nothing anyone can do about it because it's the premise of the show. It's actually built in to the show. So there's that access provision there in the content of the work. And I think for me, it's about embedding that within content. So it's not necessarily about the space that I'm in. It's actually about the show itself being accessible. So I'm trying to always think of new ways in which the show itself and its content can look after myself, Jaden, the audiences, and ensuring that there is, I guess, access provisions for those that need it. I am always looking for sort of new ways and making sure that I look at the space that I am in and making sure that I can kind of think about, okay, what are the kind of main requirements that I can look after, and then if there are any kind of additional requirements, try within my kind of capacity as an individual, try and make sure I'm accounting for all of those like more nuanced kind of access requirements. And I think I use the word nuanced because I see the way I see access is that it is very individual. There's a reason why a lot of my work during the pandemic has been advocating access riders, and why I've been sort of talking about them a lot online and doing workshops on them, because I see those as really fundamental to understanding individual requirements. And, you know, in the similar way of how, you know, riders historically, you know, stem from like musicians and what, you know, musicians would have on tour and stuff like that, you know, for drinks and whatever. I think there's something about the term access rider which really makes it feel like a fundamental practice. It's this like fundamental thing that you do before a gig, before a show, before whatever it is that you're doing. The decision to make my access rider public on my website was, I would say, fairly recent. I've been practicing with an access rider now for about 3 or 4 years. And the impact it's had is quite phenomenal, really. I've said this to quite a few people in the past who have asked me about often questions like, how people have responded once it's been sent to them. Because I used to send it in a different way, which would be like an attachment on an email, quite often to new collaborators who I haven't worked with, to say, here's my access rider, please read it. And also send me an email back when you've read it, so I know you've read it. And the response usually is like, it's quite overwhelming, really, because you give something so personal to another person and hope that they receive it in a way that is with care. And quite often I've had responses back from people which say, I'm really like moved by this rider, and I'm really moved by like what it says, and it's really helpful for me as an organizer of an event, or a person who is on the other side of working with me, who feels more equipped to support me. For me, it's about giving clarity. It's about limiting the emotional labour for me to have to keep telling people. It's a thing that can exist and communicate that without me having to say it to every person I meet. I would say the response has been really positive, and I've never really had anyone come back otherwise. I think it's always been a positive experience. The way I'm thinking about this is, if we say that we are fully accessible and that we've achieved access and accessible for everyone, then there's no room for growth, there's no room for nuance, there's no room for new things that happen. People are disabled in so many different ways that I really believe that we're not going to be able to be fully accessible. We can only keep striving to better ourselves and keep striving to do better. And I think it's about the persistence to be better and to do better to support disabled artists, because generations after us need to see that's a constant work ethic that we do.
Thanks, Vijay. That was really illuminating. And finally, I spoke to Damien Coyle, CEO of University of Atypical. Hello, Damien.
Hi, Mandy. Nice to speak to you.
Yeah, and yourself, love, and yourself. First of all, I'd just like to ask you to tell us a little bit about the organisation and its work.
We're the University of Atypical, and we were originally called the Arts and Disability Forum, but we rebranded about 3 years ago. So we're a disability-led organisation, so all the staff, freelancers, workshop leaders, our trustees are all disabled, and we offer a range of support for deaf, disabled and neurodiverse artists, and we also have a developmental role for deaf, disabled and neurodiverse audiences as well. So some of the things that we offer are grants which are called the Deaf Disabled Artist Support Fund grants, and we've been providing grants over the last 10 years to support artists to create new work. In the last year, because of COVID, we've been distributing increased levels of funding. So by the time that the current financial year is over, we will have delivered somewhere in the region of about £150,000 in grants to deaf, disabled, neurodiverse artists here in Northern Ireland. So that's one element of it. We have the Atypical Gallery, which is the only exhibition space in Ireland that's solely dedicated to showcasing the work of deaf, disabled and neurodiverse artists. The other thing that we do is that we run an annual arts festival called Bounce, and that's a weekend of arts events, and That's, again, the idea is to showcase the work of deaf, disabled and neurodiverse artists, creative practitioners, people from dance, theatre, DJs, the whole gamut of art forms. And we try to make those events as accessible and inclusive as is possible. So that's just a small bit of what we do.
I suppose that brings me around to something. How does the organisation look? Can the organisation negotiate examples of, creative decisions by artists, maybe impacting certain aspects of access issues?
The only conflict that we've ever had, the only conflict we had recently with the artistic integrity and access requirements was actually during Bounce, where after the piece was completed, an audience member came up to me and said that they found they couldn't really engage with the piece because they found the audio description intrusive. Now, the issue in this case was the size of the theatre space, and it didn't lend itself to having the audio describer located far enough away from the space to be able to see what was happening and close enough for them to be able to be heard by the audience members. So they were actually up in the gantry along with the technical crew, but you could hear them speaking into the mic, and obviously the audience member was wearing the headset. So it's one of those things. We've added it to the long list of learning that we compile and address every time we put on an event. So next time we look at different options, including using different venue for dance events. So those are just some of the practical things, but we don't really experience conflict, in terms of access.
I was just listening to what you've said. It was great, and that makes me think that actually what we should be talking about is tension in terms of access requirements rather than conflict, which
yes,
is a very proactive thing, whereas the tensions are things that can be resolved. Which brings me neatly round, I have to say, to a kind of, I'm going to be slightly contentious here and say there is an approach to access that whose philosophy is underpinned by the notion that it tries to give everyone the same experience, as opposed to acknowledging people's differing experiences. How do you feel about this?
I understand the ambition of trying to get to a point where everyone has the same experience, but I'm not sure if it's achievable. And because disabled people aren't one homogenous group, it's a collection of individuals who experience the world and experience art in their own unique way. I'm hearing impaired and neurodiverse, and I know that my experience of a music event or literature, reading a book, differs from that of a colleague who is visually impaired. I went to an event in Prague just before lockdown, and one of the things we went to see was this sensory installation which was designed by blind people, and blind people were leading people through the space, and the space was full blackout, so there was no light, and so your guide was, in our case, it was an English-speaking blind person. Now, I was with someone who was blind, another person who had mobility problems, and myself, was hearing impaired. I really liked the experience, but because I couldn't hear the instructions of the guide, I kept walking into things. The visually impaired person didn't like the experience at all because they thought it was not getting across the intent of the piece, which was to make people understand what it was like to be visually impaired. And then the person with mobility problems, they just had real issues manoeuvring around the confines, the physical confines of the space. So that was the three of us, three disabled people who had three very different experiences of it, Like, we do our best to ensure that audience members can have an experience at an event, and they can experience in a way that meets their individual access requirements. But we also know that experience is going to be different for each audience member.
I think finally what I'd just like to ask, it's been fantastic to hear honestly about all the amazing work the organisations have taken. Have you seen, and has the organisation seen, an increase in general arts provision in terms of access in Northern Ireland?
Organisations are addressing it because we have been lobbying for it and campaigning for it. We do quite a lot of work lobbying and campaigning with the Arts Council, and I have to say we have had very good response from the Arts Council here in Northern Ireland, and it's the same with the Department of Communities. We actually have a minister here called Deirdre Hargay, and she is really supportive of access and inclusion. That really helps, but it's one of those things, Mandy, I don't think we'll ever get to a point where we'll be 100% satisfied, because things change all the time and people's requirements change all the time, and there will be new things that will come out, new developments, that will enhance access and inclusion, but to me, the battle that's always going to be there is one about attitudinal change, and about society's acceptance of people with disabilities as being equal. That's going to be an ongoing battle.
But would you think it would be fair to say that the University of Atypical has had an impact?
Well, I don't know if you knew Chris Ledger, who was our former chief executive. Chris was a dynamo. There's no other way to describe her. But she was superb at winning, people over to the cause. And at the same time, she could be radical, and she could be demanding, and she could be argumentative, but she had great foresight and vision, and she could turn on the charm as well. So a lot of where we are in terms of acceptance and making the case for arts and disability and for access and inclusion has to go to the work that Chris did.
Thank you, Damien, and wonderful to hear and be reminded of the absolute warrior queen that was Chris Ledger, and how much we all acknowledge how wonderful she was and what a good loss her passing is to all of us. It's been great to speak to you, Damien. Thank you so much for your time.
You too.
Thanks, Damien. That was great. Always good to hear a perspective from another area of the United Kingdom. So I'd just now like to thank all our guests. It's been really great to have a proper discussion amongst disabled practitioners and disabled leaders to actually discuss the nuts and bolts and the limitations of access, which has always been our holy grail. Next time, we'll be looking at technology and access, talking to practitioners and organisations about how and if they use technology to improve and enhance access both for audiences and artists' work. So see you then. Bye!
This podcast has been produced by Unlimited. Unlimited is delivered by Shape Arts and Arts Admin, and is funded by Arts Council England, Creative Scotland, Arts Council of Wales and British Council.